Hi, and welcome to Learning with Power. I'm Scott Houston, and this is episode 26. That's 26. So for those of you who follow me in Spanish, which we don't do a broadcast in Spanish, so probably it's not many. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how to write. And basically, we're going to talk about how to write anything. Whether it's just an essay for your class, or if it's a doctoral thesis, or if it's a screenplay, or an article for a magazine, or a short story, or a novel. This is the process that you go through in order to do it. And some of these steps that I'm going to give you are a little bit modified depending upon what it is exactly that you're preparing to write, or planning to write, or trying to write. But for the most part, this process is the process that you should use to write anything, and especially nowadays. So a lot of times I'll see people talk about writing class, and they'll say, well, you have to do this, or else you're going to have to crumple things up and throw it away. Well, I mean, it's like, when was that book written? The 70s? We don't do that anymore, right? We use Word, we write on a computer. We don't crumple things up. We don't crumple up pieces of paper. They did that in the 60s and 70s a lot. In the 50s, they would type under, and and you'd see a writer would have like 20 pieces of crumpled up paper behind them. We don't do that anymore. So that changes a little bit the process of writing, and the creative process of writing. And in fact, it's a little bit easier now. It's actually a little bit easier now. All right, so let's get to it. I wrote them down here. Yay! But I know that you probably can't read my handwriting. So number one, so let's just start with number one, okay? Brainstorming. All right. So if you just have an idea to write anything, or if you've been assigned to write something, or asked to write something, or even if you haven't been asked to write anything, but you have some ideas that you might want to put down on paper. The first step with any of these things is this brainstorming. And this will help people who sit in front of their computer and they look at a blank screen, or they'll look at their piece of paper on the table or something, and it's a blank piece of paper, and they don't know how to march forward and then start developing an idea. So kind of like Snoopy, when Snoopy was trying to write his great novel in the Peanuts cartoons, and he'd be like, it was a dark and stormy night, would always be how his novel would start, and which kind of comes from film noir from like the late 40s. That's where that sort of intro would happen. But and it shows like a writer's block. So he's got like writer's block, and he like looks at it, or like in the 60s, people would have writer's block, and they would sit and they would look at, there's a whole movie that they did, with William Holden and Audrey Hepburn, that talked about a guy having writer's block, basically. If you have writer's block, the best solution is brainstorming. And brainstorming can be anything, just any idea that you have. That's, and whether it even relates to the project or not. And sometimes you might brainstorm ideas and you find, what, I think I'm going to go in a different direction. I thought I was going to write about, dinosaurs, but instead it's gone into a different direction, and I've decided to write about, aliens instead, or something else, something like that. It can change, the thought process is just beginning. It's so don't be afraid, just literally, because you're not going to have to show this to anybody for the most part, unless you've got a teacher that demands that you show them your you're brainstorming, but usually this is just your own personal notes. And you can scribble on a paper or do whatever you want as you're thinking of stuff. And what I always do is I forgot to do this. Can you grab me that small notebook back there? Excuse me. What I always do is I'll carry around with me like a small notepad, small one, to the right. Small means small. This definition of small means it's not as big as the other ones. Just, have to explain these things sometimes to people. All right, so this is the one that I'm currently using. As you can see, it's well used. And I'll carry it around with me, especially if I take a walk or something, and I'll have like an epiphany, and I'll be like, and I'll write it down, because if I don't, I might forget about it. Somebody calls you on a car or something, and you've got to run an errand, or you get distracted somehow, and then you're like, what was that idea? It was brilliant. What was it? And this helps you keeps you from having that experience. So just brainstorming, just write down ideas. You can edit it later. Don't be afraid if it's stupid. I mean, it may be stupid, but just write it down because it may not be stupid. Just write down anything, any idea that you have about it, and then you can edit it later. Don't worry about it. Okay, so that's the first step, is you just do some brainstorming. And so for anybody that sits in front of their typewriter or they're sitting in front of their computer, forget about that. Just grab yourself this or something, or just any piece of scrap paper or anything with a crayon. I don't care what you use to write with. And just start jotting down some ideas. And you don't have to write down the whole idea. Mary should tell John that this is the last time she will tolerate his drinking. You don't need to write the whole thing down. You can just write down, some notes, or abbreviate or something like that. I mean, this is just for you to understand what you meant by it later on. Now, sometimes I'll write down some notes, and I'll write it down so sloppy, or I'll write it down and I'll be like, what was that? What was that? What could that mean? Is that an S? What could that mean? But you know what? Usually it comes to me. I'm like, okay, I remember. Usually it'll come to me. Usually it'll remind me of a thought. And so, like, when I do these broadcasts, as you can tell, I don't have everything written down word for word verbatim on what I'm going to say, because that's just crazy. And when I was teaching in China, actually, they wanted me to do that. They wanted me to give them, so they could proofread a lesson that was written word for word. And I said, I'm not going to do that. I can give you an outline, but I'm not, and I can tell you what I'm going to talk about and within the outline. But I'm not going to write it down word for word, because that's what you guys do. You guys are stand up there and you're robots, and everybody falls asleep in class, and you're like, and the next thing you should observe is, I'm not going to do it that way. It's not my style. If you want people to fall asleep, then you do it that way. If you want people to be engaged and actually learn something, then we're going to do it my way. Which they eventually acquiesced to, but they always had two people sitting in my class, like to monitor, make sure that I didn't say something I'm not allowed to say, in China. But people would always tell me who they were. They'd be like, those are the guys. I'd be like, okay, all right, keep that in mind. Because it wasn't actually every class. Sometimes there was nobody. They just let me be free. They let me run wild. But I still knew that I couldn't step over the line, even in those cases. But anyway. So brainstorming. So you just write down whatever comes to you, whatever epiphany you have, whatever comes to you, and even if you only have and we'll get to that later actually. But you just do some brainstorming. You just start thinking about stuff, and just don't worry about structure, don't worry about anything. Just come up with some ideas for stuff. Then the next thing you want to do is, what I say is what I call the thesis. So if it's a doctoral thesis or something, or if it's a project for your school, it's a thesis statement. But it doesn't have to be like a formal thesis statement. You can just, if you're trying to write a script or even a novel or something that's like fiction or prose or something, you know, it doesn't matter. It's just what this is would be just, what is this about? What is going to be the title, or what is this going to be about, or what is going to be the catchphrase or the catch scene, or you know, what is this going to be? What is this going to be? You know, what is this going to be about? And that'll start to give you some focus toward, you know, how you can, you know, what kind of brainstorming or what kind of thoughts you should have, you know, and what direction you should go in order to come up with, you know, with your final project, the final product. So after you figure out, after you do all this brainstorming, and then you have your thesis, and then you have more organized and more structured and more, let's say, narrowing of your brainstorming toward a common or toward an end goal. Once you do that, and you have a whole bunch of things on pieces of scrap paper or in a book like this or something like that, then you go through and you start to group them. And you just put them all on a random piece of paper and you just start to like group them. And so you start to organize your ideas now. And you start now to organize the thoughts that you are having. And so now it begins to have some structure. And this is what's necessary in order to finally start putting together your outline. And so you just take these things, well, this, and this should happen here, and maybe this should happen before this, or this should happen after that, or things like that. You just start grouping things, or maybe some associated like ideas, you want to put them together because maybe that's going to be a paragraph or even a chapter or something like that, depending upon what you're writing. And so you want to start organizing these thoughts now. And so now you know what you're going to talk about, you know what your central theme is going to be. You've got more organized brainstorming now, and now we're going to start to organize the brainstorming with what I call grouping. Number 3, grouping. And you can literally do it by like having a bunch of notes on a piece of paper and like putting like an A by this and an A by that and an A by that if those all kind of go together, and a B by this and a B by this and a B by that if those ideas all come together. And that'll also give you an idea of like structure. So your A ideas can be like your first thing, and then the first, you know, Roman numeral 1, and your B ideas can be like Roman numeral 2, and your C ideas can be like Roman numeral 3, you know, within your thesis, or it's going to be within your outline. Okay? And so that's how we work up to where we've got enough stuff now to start with an outline. And when I write something, actually, I want to get to the outline part of it as soon as possible. I start with the outline like very early in my process. And so that is actually step 4 in this process. It's called the outline, which is the single most important thing for you to do in any writing project, is to make an outline. Now, if you have to hurriedly write up an article for something, if you're doing something online and you have to churn this out within an hour or something, you may decide, you know what, I don't really have time for an outline. But even your article, as you're writing it, still has to have some structure, and you're still kind of moving things around. So you're still essentially doing an outline. You're just not doing the Roman numeral 1, A, B, C, subset, da, 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 you know, capital A, B, C, subset small a, B, C, things like that. You don't necessarily have an involved and detailed outline like that. But even within your writing, and even if it's only all on one page, or like it's 600 words or something, you can still, it still needs to have structure, and you still need to move some things around sometimes, which essentially is what an outline does. And so that's what we do today, is we write from outlines. So everything we write from an outline. And so instead of throwing things away, you know, so I was saying, so I was read before where people read, well, the reason why you need an outline is because this keeps you from having to throw papers away and some other things. And it's like, I was like reading about that, and I was like, what is this, the 1970s? You know, come on. And maybe that was the reason to make an outline back in the 1970s, but today that is the most important thing that you can do. It's critical. is you just start with an outline. And so an outline starts to give your paper or your play or your screenplay, your script or your novel or article or whatever it is that you're writing, it starts to give it some structure. And while you're putting things down in an outline, and you're just writing things that you basically have in your brainstorming, like, you know, John confronts Mary. Something like that, if you're writing fiction, let's say. You know, that's all you have to write about it. That's one of your outline points, okay? And then you have to find a place where that should occur. You know, where do you want to put that? You know what I mean? And then and if you decide to do like a Tarantino thing, you know, with all these flashbacks and all this kind of stuff, you can always change things around. You can make things that happened like later in the play or later in the script or the movie or the book or whatever happen first. And then you start out with this scene and then you kind of like explain it, you know. So like this is, you know, he has an accident, and we start out with that. And then we go back, you know, 6 months, and this is how, you know, we work up to that moment. And so you may decide to do something like that, you know. But that's all going to be done as part of your outline. And so you put it all in your outline, you put everything in your outline, and then from your outline, this is your skeleton, this is the foundation for your project, for whatever you're going to write. And so there it is. There the whole thing is, from beginning to end, from soup to nuts, everything, all your ideas, now it's all been organized and it's all in an outline. That's not your final product, but at least from here, you can get to the end a lot easier. And so the rest of the process really is all about just trying to flesh out the outline. And so now you can think about each individual scene or each individual point or each individual part of the outline, and you can try to flesh it out. Now if you're just making points, that brings us to number 5. Expand the points in the outline into complete thoughts or into complete sentences. You know, I mean, if you're just writing a smaller essay or something, into complete thoughts or to complete sentences. Or this is also where, if you're writing a book, or especially if you're writing a script, is where you can start to add in like dialogue. You know, so John confronts Mary. Okay, well, what does he say? How does he do that? You know, and what does Mary say back? You know, and a lot of times I like to write dialogue with like a partner, because otherwise I find that it just looks like Scott is talking to Scott. Because I have my verbiage that I tend to use. You know, I have my style that I tend to express myself in, you know, the way that I write and the way that I talk or the way that I think, you know. And so if I write the entire dialogue, it's kind of like Scott's talking to Scott and Scott's responding to Scott. Sometimes if I'll have a partner, I'll be like, well, my character would say this, what would you say? And he'd be like, well, I'd say this then. And I'd be like, oh, really? Oh, that's interesting. And sometimes that can like spin you in a whole different direction. And sometimes you can come up with what's called like a change, or like it seems like the movie or the script or the book or something is marching in this direction, but then we find out, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't true at all. Actually, this other thing is true. So then actually this was true. And so some of these changes or some of these you know, surprises or whatever. And honestly, if you're writing a fictional thing, or even if you're writing like historical fiction, like even if it's like non-fiction in a way, you still want to have some things like that included, because that keeps it interesting. You know, because if it's too predictable, and we already know right almost from the beginning where this is going to go and how this is going to end, then it's very boring and there's almost no reason to read it. But if you read it and it's like, oh, wait a minute, surprise, this other thing happens. So you need to come up with surprises sometimes. And sometimes that's why I like to, if I'm going to write like something big, like a script or a book or something, then I like to have a partner of some kind, so that I can, especially with dialogue, I can bounce things off of them and see what they say, and they might go, yeah, you know, I think I might look at it from this perspective. or they're fleshing out their character, and they're just like, I think my character might look at it from this way, and I'd be like, really? I hadn't thought of that. Maybe you're right. Yeah, okay, let's explore that. And so, but all this can be done from your outline. So once you have the outline, then you know, like, more detailed things that you need to discuss. Like John confronts Mary. Well, how is that going to come about? How are we going to do that? Does he just approach her in the kitchen and say, we need to have a talk? Or does he do it in a more subtle way? Or does he find something out that he wasn't expecting? Or does Mary have a completely different, response than what he was expecting to do? For example, I can remember when I was young, and I was having some relationships when I was young, and we were having some trouble in the relationship, and I would be taking this long drive out to meet this person, and I'm thinking in my head, all these things I'm going to say, and I'm like rehearsing in my mind how I'm going to put everything, and how I'm going to express everything, and all these things are in my mind, and everything that I'm going to express, and I come in there, and I say the first thing, and I'm like, da, 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 and she's like, oh, well, da, 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 and I'm like, never mind, completely different direction. Everything that I was going to talk about is wrong now, because there's a new fact that's revealed. There's a new reveal that's happened that I wasn't expecting or anticipating, that changes my entire line of thinking. And so that can happen too. But you don't get to this unless you create an outline to start with. So it gives you an opportunity to look at this project now in much more detail, to try to understand, well, this has to happen, or this thing needs a resolution, or we need to make a change here, it's getting to be too predictable, or things like that. And that's when you can add stuff, and while in the process, you're also making complete thoughts now. You're writing things out in the complete thoughts. You're putting in some of the dialogue, and you're writing out as much as you can. It doesn't have to be totally done, but basically mostly done. And so then the next step is, after you've done all that, and you've worked on all that processes, then you want to start to make a rough draft. And that's number 6. Writing a rough draft. All right. And if it's a big project, now if you're just writing an article that has to come out real quick, within an hour or something, your rough draft is what you got there. So your outline is, you're just throwing these ideas, and you're finding all these facts, or maybe somebody has quoted something, and you're going to attribute something that you write from something that somebody wrote in his blog, or his website, or something like that, or his newspaper that he writes for online, or something like that. And you're going to attribute things to those people, and you're putting that in your thing. And then once you do all that, then like I said, you have to give it structure, and you have to put these things in order. And so that sort of starts out as like a rough draft in a way, So that's a little bit of a different process. And so then so then the key is proofread. Because your rough draft, really, it's not going to be the final thing, and that's a mistake that a lot of young people, and a lot of people who are just impatient, I guess, mistake. That's a major mistake that they make, is they don't do enough proofreading. Me, I proofread over and over and over and over and over again, and actually that is number 7. So number 7 is the final draft. And the key part of the final draft is to proofread. And so, your rough draft should actually have like 15 versions or something. You should keep adding stuff and renewing stuff and editing things and putting in this and putting in that and putting things out, pulling things out and putting things in, and having maybe that can come up with another idea or things like that. And so the more you proofread, the more you'll spot things like grammatically that might be wrong and things like that, but also even fundamentally wrong or something. You might say, no, you wouldn't say that. Or sometimes you might forget a word like not. You know, he's not going to do this, but what you wrote down was he's going to do this, which if anybody else would read that, they'd be totally confused, but you forgot to write in the word not. That changes everything. And so, you know, even one word, you know, can be important, you know, when you're doing a proofread. I remember reading about something that Oscar Wilde said. Now, Oscar Wilde wrote a lot of poetry, but he also wrote like articles and anecdotes and stuff that were published in newspapers in those days, in the 1890s. And he said, you know, I wrote something, in the morning I wrote, you know, an anecdote or a poem or something like that. And at lunch, I took a long walk. And in my long walk, I decided to remove the word of, or if, or something like that. And then after lunch, I thought about it for 3 more hours, and I decided by the end of the day to put the word back in. And that's basically what that's what proofreading is all about. You have to read it and think about it and mull it over and think about it. And then you may find out actually as you're doing all this, you might say, you know what? We need to change something here. So you're like doing like pre-editing. So like an editor of a movie or something is going to sometimes take some things out. And sometimes they might decide that they need to get footage or need to film something else to kind of put something in. Sometimes when you take something out or you put something in, it changes other parts of what you wrote. And then you have to go back in and you have to see, well, so because, no, Jane is dead by then. So that means that this happens, and then he has to say this, and then this happens, and the cops come by, and now he has to pretend to be blah, blah, blah. And so it changes, it can change everything. Sometimes one new idea or one new epiphany that you add during the rough draft phase can actually change, 10 different spots of the script. And it may even change the order that you have to put things in. But that's the beauty of like doing things on a computer now with Word, is you don't have to crumple things up anymore. You can just copy, paste, and move stuff around. It's a lot easier to move around thoughts and ideas. And so you can do a Tarantino thing and you can say, you know what, I want to do this all with flashbacks. And so you can move things, you play with the time frame if you want, You can put in a change, you can put in a surprise, you can introduce a new character if you decide that's necessary. You can do all kinds of things. Or you can just put in more facts, or you can kind of focus on a certain aspect or something. So if you're writing for the Journal of American Medicine Association, and you're writing and you're citing all these facts, you may decide, you know what, I need to focus more and get into more detail about this particular aspect of what I'm writing. Maybe I really need to explain what this is, or something like that, or what the ramifications of this can be, or something like that. And so, a lot of changes can happen during the rough draft phase, and you might wind up, like I said, having 15 or 20 copies of what the final product winds up being. Especially once you start to share that with other people, and other people start to chime in with their ideas, and they're part of a paid crew. So like the director might say, you know what, I don't think we'll have that. Or sometimes, I remember writing something once and arguing about a piece of dialogue with a friend of mine. Finally, he gave in to me, because everybody does usually, and we did it my way. And then the person that we thought was going to read this read it, like on a table read, and they threw it out entirely and said something completely different. And they said, I think my character would say this. And we looked at each other and we were like, okay. So the whole half hour of arguing that we did over one word, out the window, because they chose to say something completely different, which actually was better and more appropriate, and really did fit in better with their character. They saw the character, felt the character better than we were able to, because if you're just writing even with 2 people, you don't always you have to have like 10 characters. You don't always know the backstory necessarily, or you don't really understand the backstory necessarily of all 10 characters. All right. So now, that's the basic principle for how you write. So let's talk about script writing. Okay, so script writing uses all those processes, and then it actually goes a little bit beyond that. And a novel also does as well, you know, of course. So, you know, as you're fleshing this all out, so that the key thing is to all scripts is, so if you've ever read, if you've ever seen the movie called The Descendants, came out in, I think, '09 or something, starred George Clooney. That is an excellent lesson in script writing. That was a very well written script. And in that movie, you have all these characters who all are well-developed characters and all have well-defined backstories. And they all have very different perspectives of looking at the same situation, which is really how real life happens. And it was kind of interesting in this movie because all the conflict is all related to the fact that every character has their own viewpoint about the same situation. And that's really more like real life. In the 50s, the way that they wrote scripts was a little bit more simplified. And they had an idea for a script, and they would write out like a final draft for a script. And like I said, you know, in the 50s, it was harder to move things around a lot, you know. You had to crumple this up and you can start over again. And now it's easier for us to do this. And so you would, so what happened a lot of times is they would have a script and they have a story. And the story, basically they have an arc of the story, and this is the story. And this is how the story is going to go. You have a thing called the arc of the story. And so you have different parts of writing, you know, especially if you're going to write nonfiction. So you have like an introduction, you have different acts, act 1, 2, and 3. You have a denouement, you know, which is like the end, you know, where things get wrapped up, things like that. You have the climax, you know, and so you work up to the climax, and then you have like the falling action, you know, and that's all important part of writing, of course, obviously. And that's all, but that all relates specifically to like story writing. But what people would do like in the 50s is they would have all those things, they would write all this out and have the climax and the falling action and all these things. And they would have the story all planned out. And they would introduce characters a lot of times, and I see this in like Indian films and things like that a lot of times, even still, even modern ones. And so they'll introduce sometimes a character whose sole purpose is to just move the story along. And so he does things and says things in a very sort of contrived way that doesn't necessarily seem real believable, that anybody would actually think that way or act that way or react that way or do something like that, you know, but it moves the story along. And a lot of times people will just throw in a bad guy that's like a real simplified bad guy that's just for the purpose of creating some kind of a conflict and moving the story along. But the most important thing, especially with scripts, is character development. And I can't say that enough. You know, you can have all the action and sci-fi and CGI and whatever, all the cool stuff and explosions and car chases and all the cool stuff like that. But none of it means, or kung fu, none of it means anything without really well-developed characters and a really compelling story. So not just like, so I remember somebody in China, I mean, they're way behind America as far as script writing because they don't seem to understand. I'm not saying everybody, of course, but in general, Chinese movies don't seem to understand this concept. They're like, oh, we're just throwing a bunch of kung fu and all this, and it's really extreme and everything, and then, you know, everybody will be glued to the TV and watching all the cool kung fu and CGI and stuff. And a large percentage of the population might be like that. And maybe even a larger percentage of the Chinese population is going to still be mesmerized looking at all that. But you're not going to do very well in a Western market that way because we're used to good stories. And we expect to see a good story. And we expect to be engaged by a good story. And if it's a really good story, you can film it for $10,000 on Super 8, you know, from the 70s or something, and it'll still be good because it's a good story. As long as it's a good story and you've got well-developed characters, then it will still be popular. It'll still be entertaining and worth reading. And so what you do is, instead of writing well, we have the rising action, we have the introduction, and we introduce the characters in the first act, and then we have the rising action, and it comes up to the climax, and then we have the falling action, which is the denouement, and where everything wraps up. Okay. Rather than writing it all like that, the way that you should really, I think, the way that you should really look at it is kind of like what they did in The Descendants, is you have like these 7 well-developed characters, and in your mind you know exactly how these people are. And the characters, once you have that, once you have a really well-defined characters in your mind, the characters themselves write the script. They will tell you what the script should be, and what they're going to do, what their character is going to do, and what their character might say. If it's well-developed enough, they will tell you. And then you're just writing down, well, this is what the character would do, and if you put these 3 characters in the same room together, this is what's going to happen. And so that's actually, to me, the cool part about being a writer is you're God. I have invented this and this and this person. They exist because I say they exist. And now I'm going to have them do all these things. And we're just going to wind them up and let them go. I must stab you because I hate you. You know, whatever. You know, and that's how you should write a script more, is with character development, and let the characters dictate what should happen next. Because there's nothing more irritating than watching a movie and getting really engaged in the movie, and suddenly a guy does something that just really seems out of character. It's just like, I don't believe that. I don't think he would have done that. That's ridiculous. That's not within his character. But maybe it was really convenient to, you know, first act, second act, third act, climax, and then the denouement. Maybe it fit in within that structure, you know, maybe it, you know, with the arc of the story or something like that, maybe it fit in with all that, you know, for him to do it that way. Or maybe it was a change, a surprise, just for the sake of making a surprise, which you shouldn't need to do. You should have surprises by saying, okay, these are going to be the facts of the story. And these people may not be aware of the facts. And these people may be hiding the facts or lying or something like that. You know, and that's ultimately what will change what will create changes. You don't need to make a change just for the sake of making a change. You have to make it more like the set of facts to begin with. And if you decide to make a change, sometimes the difficulty is it actually changes the entire script. And then you have to go back through the whole thing, 120 pages of it, because it's about a page per minute. And you have to go through the whole thing, and you have to say, you know what, if that's the case, then this scene wouldn't happen like that. Because if this guy already knows that this is going to happen, or he already knows this because he knows the truth, but he's lying about it, he may say this, but he wouldn't say it in that way. He would be more dry about it, or he would be more nervous about it, or something like that, depending upon his character. Whether he's like a nervous Nelly, like Barney Fife, or whether he's like a really cool character and he can just lie, and you know, he's sociopathic and he doesn't seem to have any conscience about it, you know, like Silence of the Lambs or something, you know. Different characters, right? Different people. And different people are going to say and do different things. And that's the beauty of not only a script, but of a book too, of a novel, or even a short story. Is, you know, everybody has to have, you know, people aren't going to read something or watch something unless it's interesting in some way, and so it means that it has an interesting, likable character. You know, you have to think about. So, like a lot of times when people will make an outline, right, and they'll say, well, I woke up, or the character wakes up, and then he brushes his teeth, and then he washes his face, and he puts on his clothing, and then he went out and he got into a traffic jam. I mean, that's not interesting, you know. So conflict is another important thing if you're telling a story, you know. Conflict, something has to happen. There has to be some reason why you're telling the story, that story. Something has to be different about this day than all the other days. And you can have it be like, so like the movie with Jim Carrey. I forget the name of the movie. Where he's actually been in a Truman, the movie Truman. That's it, Truman Capote. That's what reminds me of him. That movie. So Truman, in the movie Truman, he starts out by just, he just has this typical day, right? And his typical day is just this typical day, and everything's fine and sunshiny in this beautiful utopia land that he lives in. But one day something different happens. And that's what creates a story. It's the same thing as a more recent story. Ryan Reynolds. It's more recent. It has to do with modern technology and like gaming or things like that. Can't remember who he was. Anyway, it turns out he's a character in a game, but somehow he's got like a soul or a conscience, and he doesn't know why. And he's like, he does something, to this day he does something different. Something that's outside of the program. Something that the program is not something that the character is not supposed to do, And so he looks someplace and he's like, wait a minute, that's a cardboard cutout. That's not actually a building. What's up with that? And so, and so there has to be something that happens that makes this day different. Why are we telling this story? What's the conflict? That's what's going to create the interesting thing. And the conflict doesn't always have to be. It doesn't always have to be like that. Conflict can just be like. It can be with weather is not cooperating. It can be you had a flat tire. It can be somebody just isn't going to do something, no matter how much you try to persuade them. It could be, all kinds of conflict can be all kinds of things. But there has to be some reason for telling the story. And then also when you're deciding who are going to be the antagonist and who's going to be the protagonist, that's what creates a conflict usually, is you have a protagonist and he's going up against the antagonist. And the antagonist has different ideas because the antagonist is Dr. Evil. And he wants $1 million. Or else he's going to wreak havoc on the world. And that's a kind of a funny, purposely simplistic antagonist, but you get the idea. And but the antagonist has to be either campy or clever or realistic. And so a lot of times, I'll see somebody that wrote something and they'll be like, well, there's these two sisters, and one is good and one is evil. And the evil sister does this and the good sister does this. And yeah, that works for like a children's story, something that you're going to tell a 10-year-old or something like that, but it doesn't really work for like adults. And so like script writing is actually, or storytelling has actually become a lot more sophisticated. Like since the days of Shakespeare, a lot more sophisticated. So everybody talks about what kind of a genius Shakespeare was. Well, first of all, what makes him seem like a genius is the prose that he writes and the eloquence of how he writes. But part of that is just because that's how people talked in those days. Because if you read other contemporaries of his, like Marlowe or something like that, they write in a very similar way. So you can't, it's just not all because he's just so clever. And also, a lot of it is because he wrote sonnets, because so that's basically like poetry, like modern day music lyrics. But in those days it was called sonnets. But he had a lot of very simplistic kind of characters, and he's got one a play that he writes where he's got 3 witches. Because in the 1500s, people really believed in witches. People really believed in magic. But to do that story now, you'd have to make it a children's story. Because adults don't really believe that the Maleficent character is real. We don't believe that's a real character. You know, it's a fantasy story that's kind of for kids or whatever. We don't really believe that there's witches like that. You know, we really don't believe in magic, you know? I mean, so like even Harry Potter, when he's doing all this magic or whatever, it's written for kids. It can still be interesting to an adult, but it's not taken seriously. Like this really happened, and there really was this witch, and there really was this wizard, and he really did do this magical thing. People don't really believe in magic as much anymore, which is why, you know, religion is taking a lot of hits, you know, because they're looking at the magic guy in the sky and they're going, that doesn't really seem believable anymore. The magical, invisible guy in the sky, no less. So we've become a lot more sophisticated with storytelling, and so characters have become more real, and because we find that that's more interesting. And so I see that Ed keeps frowning, looking at me and looking at the clock, and do I need to wrap this up? He's going, you know. Looking at the time again. So I'm thinking, I'm going on too long. Okay, so there's entire books that have been written about script writing, and entire books that have been written about how to write a novel, and there's books that have been written about, you know, how to write an essay or how to write an article. But actually, all of these things can be done using the same basic structure. All right, you start out with just brainstorming. You start by thinking, like, just what are some ideas that you might have? Just, you know, what are some early thoughts that you might have on the project? Just what are some of your first thoughts that come to your mind, and maybe they get more interesting over time. Then you have to decide, okay, what are we really going to write about? What is this going to be about? What is this article or play or story? And maybe you know that right off the bat. Maybe you're being told, write an article about this. So you already know, you know, what the thesis is going to be. But maybe you're not sure if you're going to be pro or anti. You know, write an article about cooking with vinegar. Well, you don't know if that's going to be good or bad. And so you have to decide about that maybe. Or something like that. I'm not a cook, but you know what I mean. And then once you come up with what this is going to be about, pro or con or the title or whatever, then you can start to take your brainstorming and start to organize it with the grouping, okay? And then from there you can make an outline. And then you can actually sit down at a computer and actually write down an outline. And you can use Roman numeral 1, A, capital A, B, C, and then subset small a, b, c, and things that you can do it that way if you want. It's not required. It's mostly for you to work on. This is because your outline is basically going to be a working script, a work in progress. This is the foundation of the work that you're going to do. This is where it begins, and it may only start out with one page of stuff, but then you're going to expand it, and you're going to expand all these ideas and all these thoughts. And then it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until before you know it, you've got too much. And so then that's number 5. Number 5 then is expanding all of the points that you made in the outline. And it could be that you're adding stuff. You know, you're like, you know what? This should happen. And then and you want to introduce a new character, and then maybe that starts a whole new subset of things and things like that. You know, and so that can the first outline that you make can change. It's a very fluid thing that goes through countless changes. But then the next step is you expand the points in the outline to make them more complete thoughts. So you think about each point of the outline, and then you think about it. And you think about it. So like, one of the problems with people that are trying to write movies is they're like, I've got a great idea for a movie. You've got this, and they're like, well, so come up with like a tagline for that. Because that's mostly what people have time for. They just want to hear your tagline or something like that. And they give you 5 seconds. All right, give me 5 seconds. Okay, so think Dances with Wolves, only with pigs. You know, or something like that. And so that's an example of like what a tagline could sound like. And the guy might go, contact my people, have your people contact my people, and you're in. Or you might go, that's ridiculous. But because most people haven't actually developed their story well enough. They haven't actually thought about the whole thing. And once you sit down and you really think about it, and you're really like, well, wait a minute, could that really happen? Could a guy really do that? Could a spaceship really do that? Is that really possible? Do I really want to write about something that probably isn't possible? What kind of a world would that be possible in? Do I have to make it a fictional world? Do I have to make it a fantasy world, like The Hobbit or something? Or do I need to make it in the future? Or do I need to make it in the past? You know what? And then you need to start thinking about things. And you start thinking about each point and really putting a lot of thought into it. And so the best written things are the things that have had the most thought. And that people have thought about each part of it enough to make the final product interesting. All right. So when you think that you've basically got it down and your outline is more or less, and so the outline kind of becomes like an early, like if it's a script, it can kind of like almost like a treatment. So your outline can actually become like 20 pages long. And then from there, you can actually write like a 40-page treatment, which is basically just taking the outline and you're just making complete sentences out of everything. And so now you've got 40 pages, and you've got the beginning of the story, you've got the bulk of the story, you've got the main conflict, you've got the climax, you've got how it wraps up and all that. The whole thing, soup to nuts, is all there in your, in the 40-page, I forgot the term for that again. It's not a spec script, that's when, anyway, it's you have that, okay, you have that, and it's basically the whole script is there, and then you're still expanding it, and you're still adding dialogue, and you're still maybe adding scenes to it, but you have a treatment. It's called, yeah, treatment. Okay, so finally you have a treatment. So in script writing you have a treatment, you know, and it could be, like I said, it could be 20 pages long, it can be 40 pages long, but that eventually expands, and eventually it gets to like 90 pages or 120 pages, depending upon, if it's a comedy, maybe 90 pages is enough. If it's a drama or something, you know, a sci-fi movie, you want 120 pages, you want a good solid 120 pages, maybe 150, depending upon how fast the scenes are going to take place. And if it's just like a montage of things, you know, then it's going to speed it up. And you might need like 150 pages. Or you can write 150 pages and just edit it later. You know, you might want to look at it like that too. But, but ultimately, the more thought you put into it, the better the finished product is going to be. And so after you do this enough, you do your rough draft, and so that can be like a treatment. It can be like a 40-page treatment, it can be like your rough draft. That's not your final product, but it's a rough draft. Then, Ed's giving me some symbols.
Lift it up a little higher.
Move it higher.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what he meant to say. All right, and then the final thing is the final draft. When you're finally done, and you're finally finished. And the way that you get to this is you just proofread. And once you finally proofread the whole thing, and it's everything that you want is there, the grammar is correct, you can't think of anything that you want to change anymore, you say, you know what, I'm done. And then you're done, and you leave it alone. You're done, you know, because if you keep thinking about it, you can keep changing it in all kinds of ways. But at that point, it's good enough that you can submit it to whoever your editor is, or your teacher, or your agent, or a producer, or whoever it is that you're submitting it to. At that point, it's good enough to submit. Okay, and so that's basically how to write, you know, in a nutshell. I'm in a nutshell. Okay, it's Austin Powers. But anyway, that's how to write in a nutshell. And those are the 7 steps to writing. All right, my 7 steps to writing. It can be applied to anything that you're writing. And so I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this helps you in some way. And again, my name is Scott Powers Houston. This is episode 26, Learning with Power. Please like, subscribe, share, tell your friends about it. Excuse me. And we'll see you next time. And until then, you have a great day. Take care.